Yeah, thanks a lot, thanks for giving me this opportunity to give this presentation here. It's kind of an unusual presentation for a conference or workshop because it's based on rather like an essay that discusses different approaches to studying the role of family background, and I'm very eager to get comments on this. So it's a long title: Intergenerational Mobility, Intergenerational Effects, Sibling Correlations and Equality Opportunity, a comparison of 4 approaches. And the approaches are in the title, and especially the first one is, I think, what we have in mind in the first place, but there are also other closely related approaches. The equality opportunity approach is, in my view, closely related to John Romer and his way of defining equality opportunity and so on. So I think that's related, and that's part of my story. My goal here is to explain the questions that are asked by these 4 approaches, give also a short overview of the results, and we are working on some Swedish illustrations to make this a bit more coherent and give some new results. The illustrations that I will show you today are very preliminary, and we can do more about it. But that's the idea, to go through this and illustrate with a summary of the results and also some new ones. The motivation here, I think it's important to stress what makes us interested in this. And we want to know how important family background, broadly defined, is for inequality in outcomes. And here the outcomes are long-run income and education in the first place. So it's very important that this is the starting point for us, that we want to sort of evaluate the inequality that we see in society, and address the question, how important is family background in this respect? And the 4 approaches here give very different answers to the question, how important family background is. And the reason for that is that the approaches capture quite different mechanisms. And therefore I think that by considering these 4 approaches, one can also learn about the importance of different mechanisms. Although I agree that one has to go much deeper into many issues to really understand what is going on. The 4th motivation here is also that the 4 literatures are quite separated, and in my view have much to learn from each other. When I read studies in one of these approaches, I'm actually quite annoyed that there are so few references to the other approaches. So there's some annoyance behind this essay that we are working on. So the roadmap here actually is that I will go through the 4 approaches, but the emphasis here will be in the end. And the first 2 approaches, I only have a few slides about them because most of you know about it, and it's rather a background to what is coming in the end. And here I mentioned the word synthesis. Hopefully there is kind of a synthesis, but at least there will be an overview of what these approaches capture and what they can capture, and what are the important research questions for the future. I should also say I think that the presentation is also not as comprehensive as it might look. 4 approaches seems as though I cover almost everything, but we don't here cover structural modeling of different types. But hopefully I think that the information that comes from these 4 approaches is useful input for those who consider more structural modeling. And here I also say something maybe slightly provocative, that we don't consider social mobility, which I think is class mobility. So here we stick to long-run income and earnings, and also years of education. So that's the variables that we use to illustrate these four approaches.
Link that absence to arguments on equality of opportunity?
Pardon?
Well, it's one thing to say I'm going to look at family-specific relationships, which is what I take it you mean. You're not going to look at class mobility. But in the ethical theory of equality of opportunity, class mobility would play the same.
Yeah, that I agree on, and so that's actually related to what I'm going to say later on. So, but what I mean with this is that there is a very rich literature in sociology about class mobility that I think economists tend to ignore. So I prefer to call that literature social mobility, but here it's more economic mobility, but that's not very important. So the first thing here is about generational mobility, and here my main claim is that the intergenerational associations are not very strong and imply quite much mobility, except possibly in the very top of the distribution when capital is included. So that's my claim that I'm going to show in a few slides. You know about this prototypical model, and I'm sure we will hear much more about it, that the typical approach is to regress long-run income of sons on long-run income of the fathers, and it's logged, so you get the elasticity and the correlation you get if you adjust for the ratio of the standard deviations. And of course there are extensions of this that we will hear about, that I think you know. And the general impression here from the results, I think, is for the IGEs, the elasticities, somewhere between 0.15 and 0.50. I think it's sad that we don't have similar estimates of intergenerational correlations for technical reasons. But my guess is that there is less variation in that. And there is a very recent paper by Miles Korak, Bash Masomder, and Matthew Lindquist that shows that there seems to be less variation if you go to the correlations. But anyway, the R-squares here are like between 2 and 25%, so it's not the case that you explain a lot. And I think these results on their own does not suggest that the role of that, if you consider inequality generated by family background as unjustifiable in some respects, and I'm coming back to that more, these are not big numbers. We also have here one Swedish illustration. Here we have used 6-year averages for sons and parents. It's parental income, and here total income include capital income. And for this data set, we get an elasticity of 0.24, correlation 0.16, a little bit lower than we had expected, but it's not too far from what you generally get for Sweden. And we have also shown the relationship in the rank correlation way. So we have rank of parental income. So this is very much inspired by the Chetty et al. Paper. And you can see here that the linear slope is 0.22. I think their slope is 0.34. And the non-parametric slope shows a quite big rise in the very top. So there seems to be much more action going on, and that's why my main claim qualified about what is happening in the top when you include capital income, because that is driven by capital income. Here today I don't have a similar figure for earnings, but the rise in the very top would not show up there. That's something we know from other ways of looking at it. And this is the joint density that is shown here, and the idea here is to show that the observations are all over the place, and there's quite much mobility in this pattern. Also for years of schooling, it seems as though the correlations are a little bit higher. The differences here between regression coefficients and correlations are much larger for obvious reasons, that the school system changes over time. But a little bit higher correlations, but not very much higher. So the main results here is that the income associations are not that strong, and correlations, as I have said before, and scatter plots reveal a lot of mobility. So that's a background when we now go on to the second approach, intergenerational effect. And here the meaning is of that is the causal effects of thought interventions that change parents' income or education. And of course that is potentially something different from descriptive mobility patterns. And here the main claim is that the intergenerational mobility effects are clearly smaller than the IGM estimates reveal. So here for the prototypical model, it's very important that both parents should be there, because there could be causal effects of both mother and father. So the model sometimes look a little bit different. There is now a quite large number of studies that try to get the causal effect. Some papers apply twin differences, which means difference between cousins related to differences in twin parents, which has some advantages. Some papers have used adoptive parents, which eliminates the genetic transmission, and there are also IV studies, of course. So the general pattern here is that the estimates of causal effects in the range of 0 to 60% of the IG associations. So I think that's important. That doesn't rule out that in some context the causal income effects can be very large, but the general conclusion here is that when you see these intergenerational mobility patterns, you should not consider them as causal effects in this meaning. So that's sort of a background, and now I'm coming to broader measures of the role of family background. And here I have the sibling correlation, which is the third approach, and the idea here is that the outcome has a common family component and a component unique to the individual in the family. And the individual component is the deviation from the family mean, so that gives orthogonality, and the total variance is the sum of the variances of the two components. And then, of course, the family share of the outcome is this ratio, which also happens to be the sibling correlation. But what I think is appealing here is that is this ratio. And that's what's important. It is the case that this sibling correlation captures more than an intergenerational correlation, and Gary has shown this relationship in his handbook chapter from 1999, that the sibling correlation is the IGC squared plus other shared factors that are uncorrelated with parental Y. And this is an omnibus measure that captures both observed and unobserved family background and neighborhood factors. Yet, of course, it is a lower bound because siblings don't share everything from the family background. And here I have some estimates of long-run earnings. And now, actually, these estimates have an R-square interpretation. This is the fraction of total variance that can be attributed to factors that siblings share. And now we have higher numbers. At least we don't have the very low numbers that we can get from intergenerational correlations. So actually here there is definitely a lot more. And if you are concerned about things that has to do with family background, one can start to be a little bit more concerned when you look at these numbers. So also for years of schooling, the numbers are even higher, close to 0.5, and that also in R-square terms are higher numbers than the intergenerational associations. So what is missing here? Because they are only lower bounds, what is missing? Well, full siblings have only about half of the initial genes in common, but each individual has 100% of her genes from the parents. That's something that is missing, and of course not all environmental experience and shocks are shared, only some. So there is some environmental stuff that also is missing here. So each individual can have quite much from a family background that is not shared by siblings. That's what's coming up here. For example, differential treatment by parents, and that will not be captured if it creates differences, but it's part of family background. So it would be nice to actually raise this lower bound and see how far you come. And then one can ask whether one can instead rely on the result from MZ twins. And they share all genes. I have added initial here if you are concerned about epigenetics, that genes change due to the environment. And they also share more environment, probably because they have lived very close to each other. But that's also good if you want to raise this lower bound. If you want to do nature-nurture decompositions, it's devastating if that is the case. But if you want to get the total impact of family background, it's good to have siblings who share as much environment as possible and as many shocks as possible. But this, I think, would then be the problem. They might interact more and affect each other in ways that have no counterpart in the general population. So that would make it that's a problem if you want to make inference from the MZ twins. So it might, because of the MZ correlation, might be an upper bound of family background. So what?
I'm a bit confused by that. What is the lower bound for? I mean, this. We talk about family background very broadly. I mean, so these siblings, they share most of the same policy, most of the same neighborhood, most of the same teachers.
Yeah.
It seems so encompassing that I'm not really sure what they mean by family background anymore.
Yeah, they share a lot, but of course, well, one aspect is they can be treated differently. And I think a birth order effect is something that makes siblings different. And it's part of family background. Suppose birth order effects appear because parents have more time for the first one, then that effect is part of family background, but it's not captured by a sibling correlation. It could also be that they have different teachers. It might be for ordinary siblings that the parents have divorced when one was young and one was... So there is more to family background than what siblings share. And that's why it is a lower bound.
I'm still confused. I would have the same question. It's just, I mean, there's different... Are you saying they experience different family backgrounds from the same family? I mean, what does it mean? Is there one... You seem to be suggesting there's only one family background. Yet at some level, you're also saying these guys experience different family backgrounds because they grew up at slightly different times, or...
Yeah.
So what is the concept that you're trying to measure?
Yeah, so maybe here I should, in a sense, started with this equality opportunity approach that the main motivation for studying family background here is that is something that as an adult you cannot be held responsible for that. It's so whatever comes from family background in a broad sense can be considered unjustifiable inequality, whereas effort and so on is much more justifiable. So you want to know how much come from these early factors, and of course neighborhood factors is part of it.
But I'm still a bit confused because, I mean, suppose you have twins, so twins are born in the same year.
Yeah.
So and you have a big school reform. So they're born in the same year, they're exposed to the same school reform, but siblings are not. So is that family background? It seems like it'd be more like every sibling claim, and what's anything that's not different is the same. So
Yeah, well, in that case, things have happened during their childhood that.
that will come out as family background in your setup. So all of a sudden, these two, if you go from twins to siblings,
Yeah.
any calendar time effect that hits this,
Yeah.
people at the same time looks like they're a family background. Or maybe I'm missing something. I'm not really sure.
There isn't a social component of it. And so you're right. There's no physical assumption that this gets loaded onto this. Can I ask a different question? Suppose the genes have a negligible role.
Yeah.
However, experiences in early childhood matter, and parents adapt the family environment in response to those experiences in such a way to cancel them out. Then in the equilibrium observations are likely driven by genes. In other words, you keep saying lower bound presupposes some model of the determination of the components.
Yeah.
So one thing one could object to is obviously the orthogonality assumptions in ACE class models, but saying that they're kind of, I think it's a lower bound because there's some idiosyncrasies in how the family affects the individuals. That's not so clear to me. I can think of ways that the parents make choices with respect to unobserved heterogeneity, which would lead to these to be upper bounds.
Yeah.
So I just think it would be helpful to have a more explicit description of this is how I think that these are being determined. These things are choice variables. These are not, and so on and so forth. Because otherwise,
Yeah.
I think it's too easy to come up with an
Yeah.
I think what we're all wrestling with is a lot of ambiguity about what we mean by family background effects. Sort of my extreme version of what Magnus said would be, well, if we could actually comprehensively account for everything about genes and environment broadly defined that mattered, conceptually we might get an R squared of 1, and we could call that all family background, but in a way that's just tautological, that we just decided everything that matters is going to get called family background. And another example of where do you draw the line is when you mentioned a couple minutes ago, well, then there's the matter of your effort as an adult. But I think it would make sense to presume that that's influenced a lot in itself by both nature and nurture, and so it's not so clearly separate from family background effects. And so I think when we get to equality of opportunity, I think we'll have the same issues. Well, what exactly do we mean by that? And it's a tough call. I think it's probably going to mean different things to different people.
That's why I think one has to have some more structure in terms of efforts and function of various things. And say one's not. I don't accept the Roman view, but let me leave that aside. Other things we think of as somehow domain of responsibility.
Yeah. So hopefully this becomes a bit more explicit when I come to the fourth approach here. So I have also here some estimates of correlations for MZ twins that might be upper bound, but actually they are really high. And I think that at least that it would be surprising to me if not a significant part of the difference between full siblings and MZ twins cannot be accounted for by genetics. That's what I would guess. And then the numbers become much higher. And so if you look at this from an equality opportunity point of view, then of course there is a reason for quite much concern. So potentially as much as 75% can be accounted for by family background variables in this way. Maybe I will come back to this. So when you have this, one can also consider here birth order effects as one aspect of differential treatment, but I'm coming back to that later on instead. So also if you do use this expression, what do you get? And here also I have some Swedish estimates, and of course it shows that the other factors are clearly dominating. So there seems to be something unobserved and uncorrelated with parental income, parental education, that siblings share, and that means quite much. So I'm coming back to the challenge of understanding that. So, and of course, for the last slide, there one could have one more parent and also higher order income terms, but that does not change the results very much. So there is quite much that siblings share that is not captured in intergenerational mobility estimates. So summing up here, they reveal a large role, sibling correlation reveal a large role for something in the family or the neighborhood, and unobserved factors must be important. And candidate unobserved factors here are, I think, parental skills that are uncorrelated with parental income, and there could also be sibling interaction effects. And I will come back a little bit with a discussion about how to, what the implications are for these candidate explanations of the sibling correlations.
Do you have in mind that if we knew all the causal effects, they would add up to the total family effect? I'm still sort of struggling to understand exactly where you're going.
Yeah, that's of course the challenge to understand what this is with a causal model. That's the ultimate challenge here, and my claim is that we are far from that.
The idea is that if we knew all the causal effects, they would actually add up to this family component.
There must be a causal model that explains this, but it's extremely hard to get there.
Doesn't have to be added. It's not clear the activity structure.
Okay. Interact though.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I think I said this already. So now I come to the final approach, and maybe I should have started with this to clarify a bit. And this is the approach that I think can be related to John Romer, and this is a very stylized version of it. And but it's enough for my purposes here. And the framework here is that the outcome is a function of C variables, which are circumstances, factors beyond individual control for which individuals should not be held responsible. And of course, parental resources, and I think what most of things that happen during childhood can be there. But also effort, set of effort variables, all choices for which society holds the individual accountable. Labor supply is the typical variable, and that can be justifiable inequality. And Romer also wants to put it this way, that effort can be a function of the circumstances. The effort that you show during adulthood could be a function of the circumstances you meet in your childhood. So, but that's also in this framework considered unjustifiable inequality. So the goal here is to estimate the reduced form to see the total impact of these circumstances. So this is done in the most simple way, this is actually almost naive, but I think it's enough for the discussion here. You derive the inequality that is generated by the circumstances, and you compare this inequality with total inequality and see how much that is. And here it's important that one can use a suitable measure of inequality, because the variance actually is not does not fulfill all the axioms that one wants income inequality measures to fulfill. So that's you estimate the reduced form, you measure this, and it's a very common claim in this literature that the lower bound of such that this is a lower bound of such inequality, since only a subset of circumstances are observed in available data. Then, of course, there are also many other approaches here. Some consider the rule of luck, some try to measure effort and control for it in the outcome equation, and also a lot of other quite nice tricks, I think, that are used here. But this is enough for now. And I think this approach is really nice in many respects. It's a very constructive approach. And the first advantage here is that I think it recognizes that inequality of opportunity cannot be measured by one socioeconomic status indicator, as the mobility approach does. So I think that's rather obvious, that there are more factors than this single indicator that is used in the intergenerational mobility literature. So this is a much broader approach to inequality opportunity than the mobility approach. It's also, I think, a major strength that the approach is flexible about the measure of inequality, because this is basically a normative type of study, and then it's nice to use measures of inequality that reflect different types of norms. The third advantage here is that one can easily here use multiple measures of socioeconomic status as circumstances. You can use income and education and occupation. And here I have added a note to Greg Clark's paper, where he argues that the underlying social status is a weighted average of many different types of socioeconomic status variables. And that's why the intergenerational mobility approach, the typical one, does not get underestimates mobility in society. But here one can actually do that, and I think that's a nice thing. It's also impossible here to include grandparents, because that belongs to a more general mobility model. For John Romer, of course, grandparents, yeah, that's another circumstance. Of course, we should have that. The fifth advantage is that one can include here factors not shared by siblings, for example, birth order. Also, if there is parental separation and it affects the younger siblings but not the older, there could be changes in schools and so on. So it is possible here to do something that the sibling correlation approach does not capture. As far as I see, one can also do a little bit here with assortative mating, because one can have interactions between the mother's and father's socioeconomic status variables. So it is possible here to include quite much that is not included by other approaches. But of course there are disadvantages as well. And here I think this approach ideally requires a multivariate causal model. Otherwise one must assume that the omitted variables also capture circumstances, and I think that's a major weakness of this approach. And it's also quite typical that those who work in this field never mention the intergenerational effect results. So that's of course a big disadvantage, so this should ideally be based on a true causal model. The second disadvantage here is that it cannot account for unobserved family background variables as a sibling correlation approach can. It also requires rich data and quite large sample sizes if you want to do this. Yeah.
I think you mean that the omitted variables have to be things a person is responsible for. It's the opposite in Romer's work.
Yeah, one must assume that the omitted variable also capture.
No, they can't. If they capture circumstances true, then nobody will be responsible for anything. Your epsilon and eta in the previous equation, those are the omitted variables.
Okay, yeah, sorry, that was sloppy.
Yeah, the reason I didn't mean to give you a hard time about the language so much, but that says something that's actually, I think, deeply problematic.
Yeah.
You know, so Romer's canonical example is to look at smoking within socioeconomic groups. So if I observe a black male steel worker smoking more than the median, that's the definition of his responsibility, is that gap. And he contrasts that with the different median that would exist among white female college professors and their smoking. And so that's supposed to deal with the circumstance difference. But if you think about it, why would a white female college professor be smoking given the circumstances in which the person is functioning? I could easily tell you a story. There had to be something I didn't measure, such as, let's say, proclivity to become addicted to nicotine, etc. So the notion that there's this presumption, anything I can't measure, automatically one is responsible for, not only is that a limitation in theory, it could actually reverse. You could get results such as that if I had one information set, I'd say this person's quote unquote more responsible than another, but if you reduce the information, I get these reversals.
Yeah.
And if you think about the female college professor example, they're not going to be implausible.
Even if you measure them, I mean, I don't see any distinction between effort and circumstances. It seems completely arbitrary. I mean, I don't choose my cost of effort function. I don't choose my preferences. So I mean, I never understood the idea of this. I mean, so why should I be held accountable for my preferences but not my choice sets? It seems. What's the point of the whole? I really don't see any distinction.
Yeah, well, yeah, but.
Romer does have an answer for that.
Pardon? Yeah.
Well, it's a cheating answer. He says he has no opinion on the subject. The political process should somehow decide which we care about, but conditional on that, this is the way you do it.
I don't even know what that means.
No, if you say to me, a gene's a circumstance, whether or not we want to control for that is a political decision. So his idea was, we have the debate in this room, we vote on the stuff that's going to be the circumstances, and then we proceed. But the problem with the procedure is what you said, which is there's this meta issue. After all, I suppose that there's some theories in physics that say there's free will doesn't exist instead of done, and then you have to start backing off of that if you want to come up with a principled basis for the dichotomy between circumstances and effort. That's a digression.
Yeah. Yeah. Well. Yeah, but still, I think one can think. Labor supply, I think, is an effort.
That depends on preference on leisure consumption. I didn't choose my preferences. Maybe this is just a detour about this, but it feels a bit like the same with this encompassing family background. I just have a hard time sort of thinking exactly about what it's supposed to mean and what it's not supposed to mean. And why there's any meaningful distinction between this versus circumstances.
Let me defend Romer a little. I think his argument is first a normative discussion. What are we going to consider circumstances and what effort? In society decides that. Then let's measure how close or far away we are from equality of opportunity under that understanding of a normative concept. And I think I don't see any problem with that. I see the empirical problem that you pointed out, the measuring problem, but I don't see a problem in principle with first saying, let's define the normative notion, and then when we agree on that, let's measure. And each society has a different definition of what should be equality of opportunity. Some are more encompassing. If they are all encompassing, the only way of achieving economic opportunity is with everything getting the same, right? If you have something that is very non-encompassing, there is basically always equality of opportunity. And most society probably will fall in between in terms of political preferences. That's kind of his argument.
Yeah. Okay, so what has been done, and some results here. Brazil earnings and schooling, and here you can see the circumstance variables that have been used. For Brazil, race, I think, makes sense. And here it's both parental education and father's occupational status is used. And that sort of is a way to exploit the advantage that you can use two socioeconomic status variables at the same time, but region. But of course, it's a small set otherwise. And with such equations, you get R squares like 24 to 30 for earnings, 34 to 43 for schooling. And one can also then use other measures of inequality, which I think is a major advantage. Another study by Ferreira get numbers in the same ballpark. Here I have also some results with Romer, where we use 4 levels of parental income: parental education, parental separation, number of SIBs, and actually we also use IQ at age 18 and also BMI at age 18. And that, of course, is very questionable, whether you should be considered as responsible for your IQ at age 18. Personally, I think it's too late, because there I think there is a lot of effort involved in the IQ that you have at age 18. So I would have preferred age 14, 15 or so, but that's what we have in the data. And then we get that we get an R square here of 6%, which is far below what sibling correlation show for Sweden. But the Gini shows that 24% of inequality is due to this to these circumstances. And for the other measures of inequality, the numbers are lower, but it shows that it's important what measure of inequality you use. Here is also a US-Germany comparison, and they get about 25%. About 25% of inequality can be attributed to these circumstances. And here is also father's occupation and education, and so it sort of uses one of the advantages that you have here. So here we have our ambition here is to exploit more explicitly the advantages that this approach have on Swedish data. And here we have some very preliminary Swedish results. And it's income, and we have inequality here in terms of Gini, 20.256, and other measures for the other inequality measures. And here we use a number of different circumstance variables that to some extent exploit the advantages with this approach. So we have family separation, which gives a little bit of the contribution to inequality. Firstborn means almost nothing, which is, of course, a pity for this approach, because it's an advantage that you can account for it, but it means very little. Number of siblings means something, but not very much. Parental income, of course, means more. And we also have parental education, so this shows that we can combine two socioeconomic status variables. And here we also have added grandparental education, but that turns out to matter very little. So it shows that in the underlying regression, the grandparent education variables are significant, but in this respect, it doesn't mean very much. We also have IQ at age 18, and also added here non-cognitive skills. These are from military tests, and they are the variables that mean most. But I am willing to admit that that's not true circumstance variables in this respect. So here one can see that one can exploit some of the advantages of this approach, but in a sense you don't come very far. At least that is the case with this illustration. So one can ask here, has the gap between the IGM estimate and the SIB correlation estimate been filled by these variables? But that's not the case. In general, here there is clearly lower explanatory power than what sibling correlations predict. But the latter they are sometimes reported, but in general they are not reported. And I think it's annoying that the equality opportunity people do not compare their results with the sibling correlation variables, the sibling correlation estimates. And yet the sibling correlation are lower bounds of the importance, so there is a lot that we cannot really explain. But one can also ask if all factors shared by siblings really are circumstances. And also one can ask if the...
Then Romer would say we should vote over that question.
Pardon?
So Romer would say we have to vote over that question.
We have to...
We have to have a vote. I mean, just make sure I understand the argument. So Romer would say that we have to vote over that question. We have to have a vote. You said that the way we determine circumstances effort.
He doesn't specify what.
So this would be like his response that we should vote over that question.
Well, different society may reach different agreements on what is, effort and what is circumstances. But he doesn't go and say you should go and vote.
No, I mean what he says, which means to be a political decision. Can I give a concrete example? I claim there'd be more of a consensus that children are not, that we would like to equalize the consequences of disparity in education from age 3 to 17. There'd be more of a dispute about genetically based ability differences. And so I think in Romer's operationalization, we'd like to say, here's where there's a consensus. Okay, let's start with that, and then we can look at things where there's going to be stronger disagreements. And the reason I gave it in that direction is that his notion of responsibility does not have another notion which most people care about called deserve. You deserve things, and so that's how he would want to proceed.
But Steve, how would you proceed in that circumstance if the kid shows a rotten attitude while in school? So they get exactly the same school, and then they basically, some take advantage and some don't. So how would you, I mean, this is the line we're kind of going all over the place here, but in particular, how would you, so what would be the Romer position? You're the voice of Romer. Well, I mean, it seems very arbitrary, right? If the kid shows, I mean, why was the kid motivated or not motivated? And so
I think what he would say is,
he had a chance.
There is a distribution of motivations in each condition.
But is that exogenous? Is that fixed exogenous?
No,
or is
but
that
I think
determined by
he wants
individual effort, or is it determined by the circumstance or genes or what?
What he would claim, I'm now going to give you a hard time, is that all children should have equal opportunity to early childhood investment. If it doesn't come from the parents, there should be an enrichment program. He would say there's a consensus for that.
So it's an opportunity set. It's not a realized.
Yes, it's not realization, it's not realization.
Okay, fine. So it's not actually a measured outcome. It's
No,
basically
then
what the opportunity set would have looked like.
The quality of the schools, he would say, we would agree that those disparities seem violate this responsibility criterion. And so he wants to have an ordering there. Now, genes are obviously as exogenous as anything. Mm-hmm. And the reason that there's going to be, as I said, a conflict is there is this other idea of desert that's floating around. And so I think, again, I don't want to speak for his answer, I don't agree with theory to begin with, is that, or I used to, I don't anymore, is that there's some stuff we would have a consensus about with respect to opportunities, and then there would be the contentious things, and at some point, however the political process works, that's where the line is from.
Somehow there's a notion that opportunity is kind of objectively measured, independent of the characteristic of the child. What if I said this is a good school for a kid who's highly motivated and really smart and so forth and so on, and it's this kind of trait. And then there's another, so then it would seem to me, even in defining the opportunity sets about what is the best, then that would eventually, you'd have to, if you thought that was tailored, and there's somehow a notion that there is uniform notion of a good school, but I don't believe that's true, or a good parent, or a good anything, so.
So I think his response would be that if we observed, I mean, again, I'm making something up. Suppose we're in Texas and there's 21 per capita student expenditure disparity. He'd say even though, accepting everything you said, that somehow reducing that is consistent with his vision.
Okay, some gross discrepancies like that you could see. But I
Again,
guess-
that's what I'm referring to as the consensus sits there, and then as we look at finer things, the disagreements come.
But you want to take a position. That's kind of a relative order. So we'd say, yeah, Texas is worse than, say, Connecticut or something. But that's not saying the absolute difference between
No,
the
fair
adjusted.
enough.
So we're not going to come up with an ordinal, a cardinal measure, I guess.
Well, and that's the measurement issue, which has come up before. I mean, to play this a lot of, I also think there's an issue about how to define these relative to the objective. I said the issues of quality of opportunity to prove new theorems in mathematics. You know, what would that mean? I think what it would mean is that people, given their conditional on their abilities, have equal probabilities.
But Roman will focus on primary goods. I mean, he will never argue that there should be equality of opportunity.
I don't want to target with that. I just say that.
Right.
I think that there's a more general issue of this relationship between the objects of inequality and the way you do the conditioning. And this theory is supposed to be, I'm sorry, it's decontextualized in the sense that responsibility is kind of outside of the, it itself is more abstract than my own judgment is.
No.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. Here I'm sloppy with the language. Of course, it's the correlated omitted variables that I have in mind, and I have already said I think that for a lot of these circumstance variables that is applied in the equality opportunity approach, there is also a causal effect literature, and in general there is quite a big difference in the results. And because of this, I think that the claim that the results are lower bounds on unjustifiable inequality does not necessarily hold. I think that it holds anyway, but you have to confess the presumption in this literature is that it's completely causal. And the same, I think, applies here. And are all factors shared by siblings really to be considered circumstances in this way? And if it is unobserved parental skills, I think yes, that's not something that a person can be held accountable for when becoming an adult. So if that is the case, we don't know that. If it's sibling spillover effects, sibling interaction effects, then I think that it's harder to say. There are papers out there now suggesting that there are such spillover effects, and Magna has a piece with Gordon Dahl, but that's about benefit use. So there is spillover effects in that respect. And suppose that siblings devote a lot of effort because they interact, they stimulate each other. Is that a circumstance or is it an effort? Well, that's harder to say, I think, but after all, you have not chosen the siblings that you interact with. To some extent, I think it can be considered a circumstance. But the challenge, I think, is to understand what this is. Is it unobserved parental skills? Is it sibling spillover effects or whatever? But I think that the papers that are out there today about spillover effects cannot really be translated into this framework. But I think that's very challenging to do. So we have to understand this to determine that, and I think that's a key challenge. There are also many circumstance variables that have not been used, and when I have shown this to people from this equality opportunity literature, they become really excited. There's very little used about school and teacher quality. Health indicators from early childhood has not been used. And of course, explicit genetic information would fit very well into this framework, but that seems to be very difficult to use today. So if I sum up here, this is sort of an overview. I'm not really sure if it's a synthesis, but the first part of this shows factors captured by the various approaches, and you can see here that the IGM approach kept captures the causal parental income effects, but also correlates of parental income, but nothing of the rest. The effects only, the intergenerational effect estimate capture the causal parental effects. Of course, that's what they are supposed to do. And then we have the sibling correlation approach that captures also unobserved factors shared by siblings uncorrelated with parental income. And also the unobserved factors shared by siblings. Is that the same? Yeah, observed and unobserved, yeah. So here the real contrast is between the sibling correlation approach and the equality opportunity approach, that there is something that you can capture with the equality opportunity approach that is not captured by sibling correlation. That is observed factors not shared by siblings. And the only variable that I have found there is birth order, and it doesn't seem to matter much. So the advantage that approach has compared to the sibling correlation approach doesn't seem to be very strong. I also have put some estimates here in a very crude way for Sweden, and it's all for the variance. And the intergenerational mobility, the squared there of the correlation is quite low, and maybe half of it is causal effects and half is not. The sibling correlations in Sweden come to like 0.25 to 0.30, and that's a lower bound. And the EOP, when you have all the x's that we use, you don't come close to that. So these x's that we can use, even including IQ and non-cognitive skills, do not fill the gap. So there is a lot left, like 10%. That seems to be unobserved factors shared by siblings, uncorrelated with parental income. And I think the big challenge is to understand what that is. Actually, that's exactly what Gary said in his 1999 paper also. I had in mind getting your exact formulation there, but I forgot to do that. So it still is the case that there is something that we want to understand in order to evaluate this type of inequality that comes from family background. So this is my way of summarizing what the different four approaches does. This is, I think, is a rather critical statement because I don't think the intergenerational mobility approach addresses the inequality opportunity question, at least not directly or completely. I have, and many others have motivated such studies by referring to inequality opportunity, but I think that's unfortunate given that we now also have the Romer-inspired approach. But of course it provides an easy to understand picture that the public policy debate seems to appreciate. We know the impact of the Great Gatsby curve discussion. So, and it also tells us about the rise and fall of families. I think that's part of one of the Beckett-Toombs titles. And I think that is, of course, very useful. It's easy to understand. And the cost-counter pattern, as I mentioned, has received a lot of attention. And also, it might be easy to study and interpret counter differences and trends in intergenerational mobility than in the combined importance of a set of circumstances. So I still think this is a very fascinating type of study and a fascinating approach, but it's so obvious that there are many more variables that say something about inequality opportunity, and then that's not taken into account. And here the result is that the associations are not that strong, and I think this approach addresses very well-defined questions of high scientific and public policy importance, but the estimated effects are very small in the sense that they explain very little of inequality, and such effects do not violate egalitarian norms very much. Of course, the effect as such, I think, is something that people dislike. Parental wallet effects, as we talk about in Sweden. But if they are small, I think it's not a big violation from egalitarian norms. But of course, the effects can be large in other dimensions. I think I have already said that. The sibling correlation in a science does not provide the answer to any clear question. It has a statistical interpretation. So I think this is more like a warning signal or a benchmark where the researchers have missed important family background variables. And I think for most of these approaches we have missed them. We don't understand what it is, and therefore we cannot really evaluate inequality as well as we would like to do. And I think that this, if you consider it as a warning signal, the red light is definitely on in this case. And especially if you consider that they are lower bounds. So if you would rather believe in the 75% for the MZ twins, then I think the numbers are really, really high. So key challenge is to understand what that is, equality opportunity. I think this is, in principle, the correct approach to measuring inequality opportunity. But ideally, a multivariate model of circumstances, causal effect is needed, and that's an enormous challenge, of course. It's also very difficult to get the data that are needed. But maybe some progress of that in these directions are possible to make. So that's the final slide.